G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day, and so far you are having a fantastic week. I wish everyone is having a great week, except the parking inspector waiting at the front of the hospital this morning. I may have stayed over a car park for 10 minutes and ended up with a $100 ticket. Out the front of an oncology hospital, I don't know how I feel about that. Anyway, legends, of course, as always, we have a lot to go over in this video. And look, I've been trying to draw down the time of these videos because they trend a lot better. But look, if we have to fit it into a long video, we have to. So there's a lot to go over. Of course, we're going to look at what Zelensky has said about Putin dying, and could this be setting something up? I don't know. We're going to look at the maps. We'll compare maps. We'll also have a look over some first-hand accounts of what actually happened in Kursk, because there's a lot to go over here. Of course, there's one narrative that says all the Russians that went through the pipeline were then instantly killed, but then how did the front line completely collapse? Okay, so we're going to go over that in our mapping section. We need to look at, has the ceasefire been broken, as many are saying, and what actually are the restrictions on that ceasefire? Because ceasefire does not mean we're not going to see missiles and drones in the air. Also look at Europe. Now, as you know, I've been on a warpath calling out Europe's rhetoric versus the reality, and what their words are versus what they're actually willing to do. And I can't believe not more people are doing this. And today coming out as well with senior European officials really saying there's probably not going to be troops on the ground in Ukraine, as we have been hearing about the coalition of the willing headed up by France and Britain. So a lot in that. But the main meat of the video today, and I don't know how long this is going to take, is we are going to break down this here from the United States, their annual threat assessment from the US intelligence community. Now, this is from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. This is 31 pages. If you want to go through it, it covers all the threats to the US. Of course, including in this is Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. But you can go through it on your own time. Today, we're going to focus on what is relevant to the video. So really do implore you to go and have a look through that. And this backs up a lot of what we have been saying, that Russia still remains a major strategic threat. We need to talk about the power in the Arctic, the economy, and also, I want to expand on this a bit, about ideology and where I believe this is somewhat missing the mark. But again, this has a lot more information available to write this from behind the scenes of the US intelligence community, not just who are open source. So we're going to start here before we go through it. And this was a Politico article titled "Trump Admits Russians Could Be Dragging Their Feet on the Ukraine Peace Deal." And then further in the article, Trump has said, but it could be that they're dragging their feet, adding that he used the same tactic in his own past dealings to play for time. I've done it over the years. You know, I don't want to sign a contract. I want to sort of stay in the game, but maybe I don't want to do it quite. I'm not sure. So it is a business tactic to drag your feet, to put yourself potentially in a better situation. This is exactly what we have been saying, and this is in line with this threat assessment that we're going to go over, that time is on Russia's side. Dragging this out is in Putin's interest, and the best way for Putin to do this is in areas where the US and Russia agree. Okay, so the best way for Putin to drag this out is question the legitimacy of Zelensky, because we know the US and their administration has done this as well as question on the legality of Ukraine negotiating at this point in time. You delay from the position of your mediator so they won't vehemently disagree with that. That is the diplomacy at work. Okay, so we're going to now get into this threat assessment. A lot of reading here, excuse me, because as soon as the camera's on, my reading goes out the window. Like in a classroom, teacher asks you to read, you guys put the pressure on. Now, Russia. Strategic overview. Russia views its ongoing war in Ukraine as a proxy conflict with the West. And the West, we see this as a proxy with Russia. Even Boris Johnson has said this. and its objective to restore Russian strength and security in its near abroad against perceived US and Western encroachment has increased the risks of unintended escalation between Russia and NATO. The resulting heightened and prolonged political military tensions between Moscow and Washington, coupled with Russia's growing confidence in its battlefield superiority and defense industrial base and increased risk of nuclear war, create both urgency and complications for US efforts to bring the war to an acceptable close. Again, that Putin will delay this because the US see this as urgent to get to an acceptable close, so Putin will delay and delay as per that business tactic. Now, there's a reason not many people have been sharing parts out of this, is it does paint a far more rosy picture of Russia's then position right now than everyone in the media, a lot of people in politics, and everyone basically in Western politics and online would actually like to paint. Regardless of how and when the war in Ukraine ends, Russia's current geopolitical, economic, military, and domestic political trends underscore its resilience and enduring potential threat to US power, presence, and global interests. Despite having paid enormous military and economic costs in its war with Ukraine, Russia has proven adaptable and resilient, in part because of the expanded backing of China, Iran, North Korea. As many say, and there's been branded by the intelligence communities, the axis of upheaval. So if you hear me use that term, that is what I am referring to. President Vladimir Putin appears resolved and prepared to pay a very high price to prevail in what he sees as a defining time in Russia's strategic competition with the US, world history, and his personal legacy. Most Russian people continue to passively accept the war, or even support the war. And the emergence of an alternative to Putin probably is less likely now than at any point in his quarter-century rule. Emergence of an alternative is less likely now, so that overthrow. What I will say in this is once this war became existential for Russia at the end of 22, the price of which Russia is willing to pay has increased dramatically. And the price we have seen Russia pay previously for existential threats and wars is well beyond what we have currently seen already of their huge cost of man, machine, and economic power so far. This is why immediate actions should have taken place day one or through 22 before it was seen as existential. Now, we see here is less likely than at any point to be overthrown. What we see here is Zelensky making statements like this on the Eurovision news, that it's important America does not help Putin get his way out of isolation. I believe it's dangerous. This is one of the most dangerous moments, but he says he will die soon. That is a fact, and everything will be over. And we've heard Zelensky state this previously as well. Now, is this, I guess, foreshadowing some sort of operation or just referring to Putin's age? Well, I don't know. But it is very interesting to see that being said, as well as I think it's really important to look at historically the price Russia has been willing to pay for existential war and then this war. We need to keep a bit more of a balance there also. Western efforts to isolate and sanction Russia have accelerated its investments in alternative partnership and use of various tools of statecraft to offset US power, with China's backing and reinforcement. Now, one of these things is, of course, you're going to find other markets. Gazprom, they have to find other markets. Yes, they had record losses, but they have to find other markets. And this is the thing, is then alternative partnerships have been made and the previous partnerships may just never become foreseeable again. And one of the things many people like to, I guess, forget is this war did not start in 22. It started in 14, and I believe that Russia since then knew that there was probably going to be more conflict at some point, and there has been some level of sanction proofing. It's, of course, impossible to do, but since that point, Russia's relationship with China has helped Moscow circumvent sanctions and export controls to continue the war effort, maintain a strong market for energy products, and promote a global counterweight to the US, as well as military, energy, and ideology as well. And this is what I believe that Trump is shit scared of, is this relationship with Russia, China. Most amount of natural resources in the world, largest industrial capacity in the world. even if at a cost of greater vulnerability to the Chinese influence. Russia is also increasing military cooperation with Iran and North Korea, which will continue to help its war effort and enhance US adversary cooperation and collective capacity. Finally, Moscow is increasingly willing to play spoiler in Western-centric forums such as the UN, as well as non-Western organisations like BRICS, their group to press policies such as de-dollarisation. This is something I've had in my short-term overview of what Putin will try and do, is really try and get BRICS to de-dollarise. Now, the biggest thing that has played spoiler in things like the UN has been more Israel-Gaza than this war as far as just completely divisive as well. But this, of course, has had a huge effect, and we've seen then the line drawn between different centre of gravities of power. Russia has shown it can navigate substantial economic challenges resulting from the ongoing drains of the war, Western cost imposition, the high inflation and interest rates for at least the near term by using financial and import substitution workarounds, maintaining low debt and continuing investments in the defence industrial base. Russia's economy remains the fourth largest in the world based on GDP at PPP, the purchasing power parity. And this is why if you're comparing without the purchase power parity, this is false. You need to put in the purchasing power parity because it is far more expensive for let's say Rheinmetall to make a tank than it is Rostec. So it's very important to take that into account. A sack of potatoes in Australia might be $10. In China, it might be $1. Of course, wages are higher, but we need to take that PPP massively into account here. Otherwise, you're just really showing difficult information, okay? Russia's sizable ground force losses in the war have done little to undermine the strategic pillars of its military power, to include its diverse and robust nuclear deterrent and asymmetric capabilities, particularly in counter space and undersea warfare. Now, I copped a lot of shit saying this the other day, that Russia's strategic capability, nukes, subs, and space, has had very little, if not completely untouched by this war. Of course, the economy can touch those, but its tactical capabilities, conventional land forces, of course, huge price. But these, subs, nukes, space, very, very little. We'll continue on that. Russia's air and naval forces remain intact, with the former being more modern and capable than at the start of the invasion. The biggest failure, one of the biggest failures for the Russian forces was its aerospatial forces. And we have seen that definitely increase, as well as then the losses of Navy ships, that increased too. Realistically, the Black Sea Fleet, yes, they have lost some ships. They've lost a large amount of ships. Has that crippled Russia's Navy? No, there's been no touch up in the northern and far eastern sectors. We need to be realistic about this if we want to assess it. Russia is developing a growing arsenal of conventional capabilities, such as theatre strike weapons to target the homeland and deployed forces and assets abroad, and to hold US allies at risks during crisis and wartime. Russia's advanced weapon of mass destruction and space programs threaten the homeland, US forces, and key warfighting advantages. Russia will continue to be able to deploy anti-US diplomacy, coercive energy tactics, disinformation, espionage, influence operations, and military intimidation, cyber attacks, and grey zone tools to try and compete below the level of armed conflict and fashion opportunities to advance Russian interests. All this hybrid, asymmetrical style warfare. The war in Ukraine has afforded Moscow a wealth of lessons regarding combat against Western weapons and intelligence in a large-scale war. This experience probably will challenge future US defense planning, including against other adversaries with whom Moscow is sharing those lessons learned. Of course, lessons learned in blood, but everyone focuses on the experience that Ukraine has got in this war and how that then can flow into NATO militaries. Do not forget the experience that Moscow has also had, Russia has had in this war, and China, of course, they will want to get their fingers on this, and anyone else who is willing to pay. Really, I'd be looking over at India and see where they are sitting. Now, this I need to put in here because I'm very interested in this into the future. Russia controls about half of all Arctic coastline and views the region as essential to its economic well-being, national security. Moscow wants to further develop an Arctic oil and gas reserves and positions itself to reap benefits from expected increases in maritime trade, of course, through the North Sea route. This is why the Houthis are attacking down Suez, Red Sea. That North Sea route looks better and better. And of course, Russia developing at very fast pace more nuclear-propelled icebreakers, the only ones in the world who actually have then this capability. This is something we need to look at. Climate change, whether you believe man-made or is just cyclical, I don't think anyone says that the weather isn't changing. It's just, is it cyclical or us doing it? Will open up opportunities in these areas for maritime routes as well as access to previously impossible to reach reserves. Keep an eye on this. Even if I'm going with my tumour, have a squiz. Now, the war in Ukraine has sapped Russia's finances and available military resources to fulfill its Arctic ambitions, prompting Russia to seek a closer partnership with China in the Arctic. And we've been following China's movement from a non-Arctic power to a near-Arctic power, very soon probably an Arctic power, very closely. Of course, Russia are the leader in nuclear propulsion for icebreakers. They're sharing a lot of that information. This is why when that ship went down, that Russian ship carrying nuclear parts for icebreakers, we were very, very interested in this. And with China welcoming other non-Western countries, increased involvement to offset NATO countries' perceived advantages here. So this axis of upheaval and that line being drawn. Russia's interest in Greenland is focused mainly on its proximity to strategically important naval routes between the Arctic and Atlantic Oceans, including nuclear-armed submarines, and the fact that Greenland hosts a key US military base. This is why we have said, no matter how rash he says it, Trump's ambitions for Greenland, they really, really make sense when you look at the powers that be up in those areas. Sorry, did we do... I'm not deleting them as I should. Okay, let's jump on to slide number 6, military. Moscow's massive investments in its defense sector will render the Russian military a continued threat to US national security despite Russia's significant personnel and equipment losses, primarily in ground forces during the war with Ukraine. Russia's air and naval forces, despite suffering some losses and expending substantial quantities of precision-guided munitions, remain capable of providing Moscow with regional and global projection forces, while Russia's nuclear and counter-space forces continue to provide it with strategic deterrence capability. I thought they were down to the shovels and random conscripts. The Ukraine conflict has led to improvements in some Russian military capabilities. For example, Russia's initial use of electronic warfare and unmanned systems was lacking, but it adapted and innovated using electronic warfare to more effectively interfere with the Ukrainian use of radar, GPS, and unmanned aerial vehicles. Excalibur artillery shells have just become useless. Now, what I hear around the circles I afloat in, the biggest concern that I hear is around Russia's electronic warfare capability. I'd love if I knew more of that, but I don't. Of course, everything around EW at anything but a base level is highly, highly classified. But that's where I hear a lot of people saying there's a lot of concern, as well as some agencies trying to capture some of that capability as well. Russia possesses long-range precision strike capability, most notably submarines and bombers equipped with LACMs and anti-ship cruise missiles. This can put the homeland at risk, the homeland, of course, being the US. Moscow has increased its defense budget to its heaviest burden level during Putin's more than 2 decades in power and taken measures to reduce the impact of sanctions on its military and defense industry. If you want to look at how sustainable this is, top link in the description. I speak with an economist who is a professional on this specific topic around the Russian economy. Russia has imported munitions such as UAVs from Iran and artillery shells and artillery pieces from North Korea to mitigate the impact of international sanctions, thereby sustaining its ability to wage war in Ukraine and enhancing the threat its military poses. Moscow will contend with long-term challenges such as troop quality, and corruption, and a fertility rate below what is needed for replacements. I'm going to speak on the fertility rate demographics for both Russia and Ukraine very soon, as both are very dire. To be fair, the whole Western world has a dire fertility rate at this point in time. But the majority of the Western world has not gone through, the Western world hasn't gone through a massive war of attrition either. So we'll talk about this. But I do hear a lot of that corruption is actually being somewhat weeded out due to the statification, I'll call it, of some of that military industry, as well as becoming more private, state-funded into private too. Interesting to see. Now, but its investments in personnel recruitment and procurement should allow it to steadily reconstitute reserves and expand ground forces in particular during the next decade. So saying that, yes, it's had large losses, but it will be able to replace that over the next 10 years. Nevertheless, the war in Ukraine will be a drag on those efforts as long as it persists. Moscow will have to continually balance resource allocation between large-scale production of equipment to sustain the war with modernisation and recapitalisation efforts. So new equipment, also fighting the war, as well as what you can actually afford also. Okay, so Russia and Ukraine. This is a slide not many people will actually show. Russia, in the past year, has seized the upper hand in its full-scale invasion of Ukraine and is on a path to accrue greater leverage to press Kyiv and its Western backers to negotiate an end to the war that grants Moscow concessions it seeks. Continuing, the Russia-Ukraine war perpetuates strategic risks of the US of unintended escalation to a large war, potential use of nuclear weapons, heightened insecurity among NATO allies, particularly in Central, Eastern and Northern Europe, and a more emboldened China and North Korea. So the longer this goes on, the worse that these are going to get. Again, this goes back into my slide here about Putin dragging feet and then appealing to the problems that lengthening then creates. Even though President Putin will be unable to achieve the total victory he envisioned when initiating the large-scale invasion of Feb 22. Again, what I'll say, if NATO doesn't get signed off and they walk away with those oblasts, I think that is as maximalist really as many had seen. Russia retains momentum as a grinding war of attrition plays to Russia's military advantages. This grinding war of attrition will lead to a gradual but steady erosion of Kyiv's position on the battlefield, regardless of any US or Allied attempts to impose new and greater costs on Moscow. Despite recruitment challenges, Russia has regularly generated sufficient personnel to replenish losses and create new units to sustain attacks on multiple frontline axes, regardless of what YouTubers and bloggers continually say about a new mobilisation every couple of weeks that never fucking happens. It's not Russia literally stealing guys off the street with force. While Ukraine has increased its overall personnel intake since new legislation on mobilisation was passed in spring 24, Kyiv has stretched its resources trying to launch new offensives such as Kursk, Russia, and build more brigades while defending on all fronts. Again, Kursk. I just never get it. I'm going to talk more about it in a second on the maps. Moscow's rising defence spending and investments in defence industrial capacity will continue to enable a high level of production of critical capabilities such as artillery, long-range missiles, one-way attack UAVs, and glide bombs, and to ensure Russia retains a firepower advantage over Ukraine. Both Putin and Zelensky are interested in continuing discussions with the US on how to end the war and have shown a willingness to test partial ceasefires. Nonetheless, Putin is probably attuned to the potential for protracted conflict to drag down the Russian economy and prompt an undesired escalation with the West. So he sees that as a risk. And Zelensky probably understands that his position is weakening. The future of Western assistance is uncertain, and a ceasefire may ultimately become a necessary recourse. The problem is the longer this goes on, the worse that may get. Again, we look at, I shared with you yesterday that it may become a necessary recourse, but we look at that no matter what the Allies do, it will just then turn into a gradual erosion of capacity. However, both leaders, for now, probably still see the risks of a longer war as less than those of an unsatisfying settlement. The risk to what? A risk to their power or to then their population. For Russia, positive battlefield trends allow for some strategic patience, and for Ukraine, conceding territory or neutrality to Russia without substantial security guarantees from the West could prompt domestic backlash and future insecurities. The domestic backlash there, I think, is very worrying to Kyiv. Cyber. Russia's cyber capabilities, its repeated success compromising sensitive targets for intelligence collection, and its past attempts to pre-position access on US critical infrastructure make it a persistent counterintelligence and cyber attack threat. Moscow's unique strength is the practical experience it has gained integrating cyber attacks and operations with wartime military actions, almost certainly amplifying its potential to focus combined impact on US targets in time of conflict. And this is something we don't see for experience, is what Russia has been able to do, whether successful or not, I don't really know exactly. A lot of this is kept hush-hush though, is it has been able to have conventional military action while real cyber attacks and gain that experience. Of course, there's cyber attacks everywhere, but not in line with conventional attacks. That experience is solely to the powers in the war. Russia has demonstrated real-world disruptive capabilities during the past decade, including gaining experience in attack execution by relentlessly targeting Ukraine's networks and disruptive and destructive malware. Again, I'd like to know how effective that really actually is. Malign influence activities. Moscow uses influence activities to counter threats, including by stoking political discord in the West, sowing doubt in democratic processes and US global leadership, degrading Western support for Ukraine and amplifying preferred Russian narratives. Moscow's malign influence activities will continue for the foreseeable future and will almost certainly increase in sophistication and volume. Now, I don't doubt that this has occurred, but what I will say is the Western countries, they are sowing far more doubt in democratic processes than anyone else. It's the stick in the spokes and blame Putin now that he may exist at a small amount. But what occurred in Romania, what has occurred in the US, what is occurring in Estonia, what is occurring in the UK, that distrust in those systems, you're throwing the Putin stick in the spokes if you believe that that is the complete influence of that. Although I still do believe that Russia is a far greater ideological threat to the West than it is conventional military threat. That this move to paint as a traditionalist conservative, and we see, look at the voting in Germany with the AfD, that shift right, and we're going to see, in my opinion, over the next decades, a large shift right in Europe. Traditionalists, not due to Putin's successful intelligence campaigns, no, due to the complete rejection of the postmodernist left wokeism, whatever you want to call it, amongst societies, being drowned by things like migration and taxes and whatever else, that is having far greater effect. And I think that needs to be looked at rather than a very slow success there than just conventional capabilities. That I believe a lot of Western states are poisoning themselves. It's not poison coming from the outside in. Moscow probably believes information operations efforts to influence US elections are advantageous regardless of whether they affect election outcomes. See, slight contradiction. Russia uses a variety of entities such as US-sanctioned influence organisations, say these ones here, to shape public opinion in the US, amplify and stroke domestic divisions. And what I'll say is, I'm not saying that this is right, but I'm saying all large states do this to affect their world order. Look at USAID. Although that is coming out slowly, I don't see what Sesame Street in Iraq is really having effect. Weapons of mass destruction. Russia has the largest and most diverse nuclear weapon stockpile that, along with its deployed ground, air and sea-based delivery systems, could inflict catastrophic damage on the homeland. Russia has developed a more modernised, mobile and survivable strategic nuclear force that is intended to circumvent or neutralise future augmented US missile defence and ensure deterrence through a reliable retaliatory strike potential. In addition, Russia's vast arsenal of non-strategic nuclear weapons helps it to offset Western conventional superiority and provide formidable escalation management options in a theatre war scenario. So there is this thing in Russian doctrine, older doctrine, Soviet doctrine, around theatre nuclear weapons used even down to artillery, used in a tactical position. Now, what I'll say is I believe in this day and age there is no such thing as strategic and tactical nuclear weapons. It's all strategic, even if it was the size of this bloody thing, okay? But We can see that that does counterweight it. This is why no one wants Iran to have a nuclear weapon, regardless of their ground capability, regardless of their air capability. Once they have that ultimate deterrent, it offsets it. This is why, of course, Ukraine is so focused on that idea of the Ukrainian nuclear weapons, even if Trump's envoy was completely correct in the shitstorm it's created online that they were never Ukrainian weapons, and the launch systems, the ability to maintain them was not there at the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the debts got paid off, so those weapons went back. Stop trying to change fucking history. Canadian Parliament clapping a Nazi. Anyway, Russia continues efforts to modernise its nuclear weapons capabilities in the face of multiple failed tests of a new systems. We have seen failed tests. We see a lot of nuclear failed tests, actually, at least just the booster of it, not with the warhead on it. We'd know about that. Now, CBW means chemical and biological weapons. Russia's CBW threat is expanding. Russian scientific institutions continue to research and develop CBW capabilities, including technologies to deliver these agents. Russia retains an undeclared chemical weapons program and has used chemical weapons at least twice during recent years in assassination attempts with Novichok nerve agents, known as fourth generation agents. Of course, against these in the UK. Now, fourth generation agent, this refers to a class of highly advanced nerve agents. This classification, this is significant because it represents a new era in chemical warfare. This is designed to be more survivable, at least to actually deliver the system, not for the person getting it, more deniable. We know Russia loves a sense of deniability, plausible deniability is the word I'm looking for, and more deadly than previous nerve agents. So the agent is more survivable, leading to it being more deadly. Does that make sense? As well as these undeclared systems. We know that there are plenty of agreements to get rid of all CBRN, chemical biological weapons. At the end of the day, from what leaked in China, was a conspiracy theory, I guess, to whatever, I don't trust any great state, given the effectiveness of chem bio weapons, not to be secretly funding some money somewhere to do this. They also say Russian forces are almost certainly using chem against Ukrainian forces with hundreds of reported attacks. Now this, as far as I have seen, confirmed, this is K-51 riot control grenades using something called chloropicrine, which is, of course, outlawed and specifically outlawed under the treaties and conventions around chemical weapons, but at the end of the day, let's not make out like it's Novichok as well. There are plenty of cases, as I have presented on this channel, of Russia and Ukraine using chloropicrine K-51 riot control grenades. Clear as day, but people only care about when it is on the narrative that suit. Okay, law should be applied just across the board. If I had longer to live, I'd actually really like to become a lawyer or bloody judge. Now, space. Russia continues to train its military space elements and field new anti-satellite weapons. You'll see this as ASAT. I'll refer to it as ASAT, to disrupt and degrade US and allied space capabilities. It is expanding its arsenal of jamming systems, DEWs, direct energy weapons, on-orbit counter-space capabilities, and ASAT missiles designed to target US and allied shovel satellites. Russia is using electronic warfare to counter Western on-orbit assets and continues to develop ASAT missiles capable of destroying space targets in low Earth orbit. Despite its Soviet legacy, the war in Ukraine has revealed glaring deficiencies in Russia's space-based architecture, which will continue to face difficulties from the effects of sanctions and export controls, domestic space sector problems, and increasingly strained competition for program resources within Russia. This is what war shows you. This is a very expensive, a hard part of war, but it shows you where your deficiencies lie. It's shown Russia these deficiencies in UAVs and EW and space. It's shown the West the glaring deficiency in just our ability to produce hard systems, shells, barrels, tanks. Okay. However, Russia will remain a space competitor, probably by prioritising assets critical to its national security and integrating military space services over civil space projects. Moscow uses its and other civil, commercial, remote sensing satellites to supplement military dedicated capabilities and has warned that other countries' commercial infrastructure in outer space used for military purposes can become a legitimate target. This is, as we call, dual use. just like we're going to see strikes against facilities. Starlink is a legitimate target. It is, if Russia hit Starlink and started taking those down, absolutely it would be a legitimate target. Just as if Ukraine started, if they had the capacity to hit then satellites. But of course, the escalation of Russia hitting that, absolutely no. But to the letter of the law, is Starlink a military dual-use application? Absolutely it is. We've seen the effect of it being turned on and off. Russian ASAT. Russia is developing a new satellite meant to carry a nuclear weapon for anti-satellite capability. A nuclear detonation in outer space could cause devastating consequences to the US and global economy in a protracted great state war with then capabilities like this, China, US, whatever. The first thing that needs to be known is fighting dark, because all these satellites and shit are going to go out almost instantly, as well as, I forget the term used, someone will correct it on me here, but if there was a satellite starting to get blown up and the shrapnel that would create and remain in orbit, you could end up with like a stuck on Earth syndrome, because there'd just be so much debris in orbit that it would take out everything else in a massive then chain of reaction chain of that. But very likely all of that would be gone. And I believe the Western militaries in general, they need to start focusing back on compass and map, shit like that, to tin cans with a bit of string between it instead of comms. Now, in Feb 22, Russia launched a satellite, which the MOD claimed at the time was for testing onboard instruments and systems under the influence of radiation and heavy charged particles. Again, with this, I don't have access to the knowledge if this is true or not. Technology. While science technology ecosystem has been constrained in the wake of its invasion of Ukraine, if you want to look at Russia's R&D and S&T, there's a book behind me called, let me read it, Sword and the Shield. It's archives of the KGB and GRU. That's really interesting to look at where the Russians were stealing science technology, R&D, and implementing analogues, and how that system constrained that but could increase analogues. It's a really good overview of how that more constrained authoritarian system actually acted. Okay, Moscow continues to deploy AI application on and off the battlefield, and has deepened technical cooperation with its partners such as China in support of long-term R&D goals. China is near peer, if not equal to US on AI. Moscow's use of artificial intelligence to augment military operations probably will further hone Russian tactics and capabilities in the event of future conflicts with US or NATO allies. Russia is using AI to create highly capable deepfakes to spread misinformation, conduct malign influence operations, and stroke further fear. Russia has also demonstrated the use of AI-enabled anti-drone equipment during its ongoing conflict with Ukraine. AI is going to be very scary for people like me on the internet, as well as on the front line. It's going to be, eventually these deep fakes will be absolutely indistinguishable. Russia's few domestic microelectronics manufacturers have only mastered production of chips down to 65 nanometers level, and has goals of producing 28 nanometer chips by 2030, significantly behind global leaders. While largely cut off from Western supply chains, Russia has significantly expanded and deepened cooperation in several technical sectors with international partners. Russia seeks to further align its S&T efforts with China and BRICS in areas such as AI and governance and semiconductor production to advance its capabilities, as well as broadly decrease the West's influence, and the West as that being global leader of that and the power it can control there. Now, military chips, they prioritise reliability over speed. The extremely small transistors, these are more fragile and less resistant to radiation and EMPs. So no, Russia is not stripping chips out of washing machines. They have domestic, but also China on their hands also. Russia's challenges, and this is very important to go over too, because it's not all sunshine, rainbows, vodka, and Kremlin. Even as Russia has proven resilient, it faces a myriad of challenges to remaining an indispensable global player, maintaining a sphere of influence and upholding stability at home. Its highest strategic aims suggesting limits on its confidence dealing with the US and the international community. Russia has paid a heavy price in blood, treasure, and loss of international reputation as foreign policy options because of its large-scale invasion of Ukraine. President Putin upended 2 decades of Russia's geopolitical resurgence, created new threats to its external and internal security and strained its economic and military potential, making it more reliant on China and other like-minded partners like North Korea. I think there's a real threat to Putin and Russia's dominance from China then really grabbing at what it wants. Russia's military has suffered more casualties in Ukraine than all of its other wars since World War II. They're quoting here 750,000 dead and wounded. With that number, you'd be looking at around 150 to 200 KIA. The media zone numbers, they are around 90 to 120, I believe. There's a bit of float in that. Its economy faces significant long-term macroeconomic headwinds and increasingly dependent on China. But also this dependency on China scares Trump too. But the UK, with these numbers, the UK today is saying that this number is 900,000 and some others are well over 1 million. Again, we're not going to know until everything comes out. Any of these figures, just how the fuck are you counting a bunker that's been hit by a HIMARS from 200 kilometres away? You just say there's 1,000 in there. Same the other way too. Russia's aggression has strengthened European unity and prompted Finland and Sweden to join NATO. These efforts by some states to seek alternative partners and is hurting Moscow's influence and derailed Putin's vision of a greater Eurasian Union. Now, I think this war so far has given illusion of European unity, but I'd say don't count your chickens before they've hatched. It's too early to tell. Look at the cracks that are developing in the European side of NATO and between the US and the European partners of NATO. We are yet to see the long-term economic effects on Russia and the long-term economic effects on the European Union, NATO side of Europe, for rearming and, of course, if they can remain competitive without cheap energy. We're yet to see that, so hold off. The war has shown also the lack of European resources too, just amount of stuff to fight a war. So in this, strengthened European unity, I don't know. I think in some states, yes, but we haven't had the pressure right on yet. In others, no. Look at Slovakia and Hungary compared to Germany, France and other areas and even Italy. And look at trend lines in that. Now, this is something to talk about, is the European rhetoric versus their ability and willingness is very, very different. So that was the full assessment breakdown, but I'm going to focus on that European rhetoric versus reality in this article then here, doing the rounds from Reuters. Europe's talks on Ukraine security shift from sending troops. As I say, do not follow rhetoric, follow actions. If the Europeans' words matched their actions, Ukraine would be armed to the teeth and it would be thriving. Now, European efforts to create security arrangements for Ukraine are shifting from sending troops to other alternatives as they face political, logistical constraints and the prospect of Russia and the US opposing their plans. France, which has been working closely with Britain to come up with other options. Of course, there's 30 countries of the coalition of the willing. There are meetings coming up in the next week. London and Paris have been working for weeks on a plan to send thousands of troops to Ukraine to help safeguard a future ceasefire. Diplomats say there's growing acceptance that sending such a force is not the likeliest outcome, because they don't have the US backing. The US is not prepared to do it. They're not going to do it if it's not their backing, in my opinion. They're taking a step back from ground troops and trying to redimension what they were doing to something that could be more sensible. Another diplomat has said when Ukraine was in a better position, the idea of sending troops appealed. But now, with the situation on the ground and the US administration as it is, it's not very sexy. Macron and Starmer both visited the White House last month, suggested their countries contribute thousands to a future force, but they also fruitlessly sought some sort of a backstop from Washington. So exactly, without the US backing, again, this was always the annex on this, was US backing. So I always said, hold your horses on it. But how France and the UK have fallen from grace over the past decades and centuries. I guess the stick in the spokes there will be Far East as well. Security guarantees are kind of an intercontinental breakfast buffet, which you have 1,000 sub dishes. In the end, it will all depend on the degree of sincerity of the ceasefire, and I'm not optimistic. And this is the European paradox. You push the US away while being unwilling to make decisions without them. Other senior European defence officials have said the focus was shifting away from the idea of European boots on the ground to, quote, it doesn't mean individual countries won't have soldiers deployed in Ukraine to provide training and other support. But even if a big European ground force is not seen as likely now. concept paper on the summit seen by Reuters refers to a possible future reassurance force in Ukraine as part of a future peace settlement with support of the United States. So a reassurance force, ceasefire force, peacekeeping, we don't know, but that has upended then a lot. Now, let's talk about Dnipro and the strikes we have seen overnight with this image going everywhere, as well as some footage of large strikes. Now, as I have been stating since the beginning of these ceasefire plans started making then ways into our bloody eyes, these deals will not stop drones and missile attacks going both ways. It just stops, well, it's meant to stop some areas of which they can hit. It's meant to stop attacks on energy if then Russia's demands are seen to, of course, lifting some of those payment systems. But this is why I see that this deal is greatly to the benefit of Russia. Of course, it has to be as per the deal, which, again, this part of the deal still has no and need access to this. So this, in my opinion, is still not in play. Some of the Black Sea stuff may be, but okay, let's say it is in play. Refineries, pipelines, electrical generation, nuclear power plants, hydroelectric dams. So these may be out of play, but that does not mean we're not going to see Ukrainian drones and missiles and Russian drones and missiles in the sky. That the ceasefire covers those, doesn't just cover everything. Now, what has been struck here? We don't know. It's impossible to know, and it's highly illegal for people to dig into, release images to get an idea. And even some satellite companies, they just don't take image, or they take images, but they don't release the images over Ukraine to get some sort of battlefield assessment here. So again, we just don't know, but it's not going to stop those. And my reading of the ceasefire with energy facilities, I'm not saying I'm on agreement with strikes. I fucking don't want anything to get struck, but it doesn't seem to be outside of that. Okay, let's look at the maps. 50 minutes in, you're getting to what we want. Of course, we have Ukraine in the center of your screen. The red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014, and the capital of Kyiv seen here. Now, the first area I want to come into is Kursk. Now, when you see blue check, that's Ukrainian advancement. When we see red check, that's Russian advancement. No changes in this area around Basivkia, although it's important to know that area, as well as Suja. These are just areas you're going to want to know in a second. Let me double check. No changes shown on the map today. Let's have a look then on the Syriac maps, and we are seeing some changes. So down this road here, that road of life, we are seeing Russian advancement down here as per Syriac, as well as see where this tree line is in here. We just need to come to the north of that. Let's have a look. Let's zoom in up into about this sector in here. He's saying that is coming back under Russian control also. But what actually happened in Kursk? Well, what I will say is Ukrainian media is actually being far more honest about this than a lot of the Western pro-Ukrainian media. Ukrainian Pravda, they released an article titled "What Happened in Russia's Kursk Oblast During the Last Month of Defense." Now, this is one of the first paragraphs. Here's how the phrase "logistics in Kursk area are difficult" should be interpreted. Not just difficult. Since at least early to mid-February, the Ukrainian garrison on Russian territory has been unable to transport personnel to positions by vehicle or to operate equipment or to swiftly send reinforcements to repel assaults. The word difficult is not harsh enough for what that was. In the end, due to Russians striking the flanks, advancing through the gas pipes, and demolishing the bridges around Suja, the defence forces did come dangerously close to being trapped. You don't understand how far the situation had deteriorated. We simply had no other choice but to withdraw. This is one of the battalion commanders. The retreat was totally forced. This is the artillery platoon commander, Dmitrio. We knew time was running out, and we only had days or hours left. Yet, we spent a week in complete chaos waiting for them, so senior command, to give us at least some kind of permission to withdraw. We've seen this again and again. Staying there and continuing to fight was beyond unbearable. In the end, we made the decision to leave on our own. There was no encirclement, but there was no planned withdrawal that would have enabled us to save our equipment either. Many units simply left on foot and marched 15 to 20 kilometres. So no encirclement. But what I'm seeing in some of this, and I'll back up what I say, is there was no physical encirclement. But with some of this and what you're going to see about not being able to bring in anything, there was definitely a tactical cutoff or tactical encirclement. Further here, a paratrooper explained to Ukrainian Pravda, they just need to push us out of Kursk Oblast and do that. They had they had to cut off the road, and hence their push to Novenki. So we can see where they are pushing in Novenki and Basivka. Keep these in mind. If the Russians do decide to attack Sumy, it certainly won't be here in Basivka. We are waiting for them, and they know we're waiting for them. So he's saying that it's not going to be here. Nevertheless, in any discussion of whether the Kursk front will now become a Sumy front, it is important to note Ukraine's defense forces have not entirely withdrawn from Kursk, still hold 3 to 5 kilometers. But much like other sectors on Russians' command's goal of attrition, I fear that what they are doing is purposely not closing that off, because Ukraine continue to feed forces in and have made a kill box. Now, I'm not saying this is 100% what it is, but it makes sense due to Russia's attritional aims to not cut off if Ukraine's still sending in. And as we have seen, the command don't want to pull out, and how important to Sursky and Zelensky, just from information, how important this is. And we know Ukrainian command will never give the order to withdraw from here, or is very unlikely to. Keeping this open while you have full coverage of drones makes sense for Russia's command, and how Russia, with their aims of attrition, will trade maybe land and time for attrition. One of their sources on this front summed it up: our task is now to stabilise the situation. It's not completely stable yet, but we are close. So keep an eye on how this unfolds over the coming weeks. Now, we'll jump onto then the maps here, and we do see an amount of then red check and blue check on the map also. So we need to come down. This is around Terny, Ivanivkia. We can see advancements here to the northwest. Let's go 2 kilometers and around Terny. Now, I do not believe that these are new advances. I believe that Suryk has showed some of these, although this is getting very close to Katerinivkia as well. So just keep an eye on that. I don't have another map to back that up today. And we'll continue moving our way down. No updates around Toretsk. This is a very, very heavy front at the moment. Around Pokrovsk, let's have a look. Kotliny, we see then blue check on here, indicating Ukrainian advancement back in this direction. I don't have anything to back that up either. Let's delete that one to remind me. An hour in, and then to the east of here, we then come to Alexandropil, Kalinove front line, and this is where we get the first Suryak update in here. So this can be difficult to see. During the last 48 hours, the Russian army took control over this Pantelyamyovka, which is this area right in here, heading towards Shuki Balka. Now, we can see there was grey zone shift there. So grey zone shift to me on this map shows there was definitely some movement. We just don't know how much, but Suryak showed some movement in here. Let's then move our way down. Kurikov front, I have nothing here. Then we come to then Velika Novosilka, where Russia continued to exploit gain of that area to then the north towards Vesely Mark II. We do have a Suryak map updating here, but showing on a different front line. Let me move then this across, that Russian entered Vilny Pole. So this is Vilny Pole right here. Again, no grey zone movement, but can see grey zone reaching out in that direction. Come down into the south, where we did see major changes on this map, confirming that yesterday. We then see on this Suryak map, Lobkove, Malishkabaki, we can see he is saying that across in this intersection through Malishkabaki, Russian have occupied full control of this, and on Lobkove as well, to both the eastern side and around on the west as well. So keep an eye down on this front line. Legends, we went over a lot. You have a fantastic day. Have a fantastic Thursday, and I will speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.